Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to today's Medical Center Hour, a program called The Death Gap, How Inequality Kills. I'm Marcia Day Childress from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities here in the School of Medicine, and the center brings you these weekly medicine and society forums known as the Medical Center Hour. Today is the last program in what is our 46th year of continuous production. It also doubles as the Alpha Omega Alpha lecture of the School of Medicine for this year. We hear much these days about the yawning gap in our country between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. Inequality is all around us, and it's taking a serious toll on personal and population health. The poor die sooner, blacks die sooner, and poor urban blacks die sooner than almost everyone else. Indeed, there's a 35-year difference in life expectancy between America's wealthiest and healthiest enclaves and our poorest and sickest neighborhoods. Internist David Ansell has worked for 4 decades in hospitals that serve Chicago's poorest communities. He's witnessed firsthand the structural violence of racism, economic exploitation, and discrimination responsible for grim health outcomes among the poor. And he's written about this in this compelling book, The Death Gap. The book is informed by his dual perspective as both a practicing clinician and an administrative leader in an academic medical center. Dr. Ansell is the Michael E. Kelly MD Presidential Professor of Internal Medicine, Associate Provost, and Senior Vice President for System Integration and Community Health and Equity at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. He comes to us today as UVA's AOA Visiting Professor, sponsored by the National Medical Honor Society, Alpha Omega Alpha, and hosted by our local chapter. For all that he's seen and done, David Ansell is hopeful. Geography or zip code, he argues, need not be destiny. Individual practitioners, healthcare institutions, social forces, and political players can join together with at-risk communities to remedy the devastating socioeconomic conditions that engender the death gap. But this isn't easy work, and because it will surely spill over into the next generation, we've invited a graduating medical student to offer a response. Tobenna Ubu, on my far right, class of 2018, will soon be a resident, training to practice and preparing perhaps to lead colleagues, a clinical enterprise, and a community in efforts to lessen or altogether erase health disparities. Toby will tell you something about himself in his talk, but I'll tell you right now that he's one of our generalist scholars, a member of our peer-selected Gold Humanism Honor Society chapter, and also by peer selection, this year's recipient of the Leonard Toe Humanism in Medicine Student Award. I'd like to thank the UVA chapter of Alpha Omega Alpha National Medical Honor Society and graduating student Ann Nisley, the AOA president, as our partners in this program. And as you saw when you came in, the UVA bookstore is just outside the upstairs door with copies of The Death Gap, which David Ansell will be happy to sign. So let's begin looking at The Death Gap. David Ansell and Tobenna Ubu.
Thank you. Well, I'm pleased to be here today. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. My father would have loved it, and my mother would have believed it. But so I'm just going to say as a preview, not everyone's going to... Oh, is my mic, can you hear me?
Yes, it is.
All right.
Yeah.
I have a very loud voice.
Yeah.
Oh, there it is, that's better.
Yeah.
Not everyone's going to like what I have to say. In my experience, some people walk out. That's totally fine. What I hope to do with an audience like this is convince like 5%, 3 or 4 people in a room, that if one follows a certain path, we can actually make big changes. And I understand in a room this big, it's usually about 3 or 4 or 5 people. But just to get started, I'm going to show you why we as primates reject inequality as a concept or as an idea, and I'm going to play a little video for you, then we're going to jump into the presentation. All right, I wanted just to show you that experimenting with the most basic of primates, how inequality is rejected. You could actually look at the monkey thing as be orthopedic surgeons versus primary care doctors. There are many different analogies you can have. So my talk today is the death gap, how inequality kills, but I really want to spend the last part of it talking about what do we do? So we get beyond just talking about it. I have no disclosures. That's me in front of the old Cook County Hospital, where everything I tell me today I learned 40 years ago when I started my internship. I know many of you are thinking, he looks very, very young. It can't be 40 years. Just a little bit about my experience. I've been a doctor for 40 years in Chicago. Started my internship in 1978. And I spent 17 years at Cook County Hospital, 10 years at a place called Mount Sinai Health System, which is a teaching hospital, safety net hospital, and then got recruited to Rush University Medical Center to be the chief medical officer. I was chair of medicine at Sinai. I was chief of general internal medicine at Cook County when I left. But my patients came with me. And it was along one street in Chicago, Ogden Avenue, and I call that street One Street, Two Worlds, because not only were there two worlds of health care, as I experienced through my own experience of what was accessible through the eyes of my patients, but there are people in these neighborhoods that were served lived two different lives. And it was a shock to me when I got to Rush, an academic medical center where everything was in reach if you had the right card to get you in the door. And people on the inside of Rush did not seem to see what was on the outside. And so as chief medical officer, while I was doing that work, I wrote these two books. One was County, Life, Death, and Politics at Chicago's Public Hospital, which kind of tells the story of what was it like to be an intern at Cook County Hospital in 1978. Come with me and I'll show you. And then the death gap, how inequality kills. How is it really working? How does it really work? And so that's the topic of my talk today. I'm going to talk in three parts. I'm going to talk about how I discovered the problem of inequality as it relates to health and how I learned to practice social medicine. Then I'm going to talk about the social determinants of health, but I'm going to distinguish them from the social determinants of inequity. It's really important that we name these things very, very specifically. And then I'm going to turn at the end this is the prescription for burnout, for avoiding burnout, which is practicing medicine with your heart and your feet. So I have three parts because if the first part gets really boring, there'll be a second part coming soon. So that was me in my fourth year of medical school. I've grown into my ears here, but actually I got to medical school in upstate New York and realized that the issues that were important to me weren't really discussed in medical school. I was really interested in the intersection between society and health, and there seemed to be no discussion about this. I was so frustrated with medical school that first year that in Syracuse there was a forestry school, and I got an application. I was a tree hugger type, outdoorsy, crunchy, and I thought I'd be a forest ranger. But I pulled myself back from the proverbial woods. I met a group of medical students, and we started studying the U.S. healthcare system back in 1974 and 1975. And all of us decided that there was something seriously wrong. And when we decided about how to sort this out, we realized that what we wanted to do was to be doctors. But I had lost sight of why am I doing this? And we were inspired by Rudolf Virchow. And Virchow, who was a famous scientist, doctor in the 19th century, words like thromboembolism, cell biology. The modern autopsy was discovered by Virchow. But Virchow was asked to investigate an outbreak of typhus in the Silesia region of Germany. And he came back, and his report was the reason for the outbreak of typhus was the lack of democracy in Silesia. And he became known as the father of social medicine, largely because no women were in medicine. But when I went from what I was doing, which was being a doctor, going to learn to be a doctor, to why I was doing it was healthcare as a human right. So when I describe myself, I'm a general internist. I practice general internal medicine, have for many years. I'm a administrator. I've been in many administrative roles in my life in medicine and have done that while practicing. I'm a social epidemiologist, but I'm also, I call myself a human rights activist, because human rights is the core reason why I went into medicine. It's my why. And whenever I have to make a decision as a doctor, as an administrator, there are not many decisions you have to make as an epidemiologist except put numbers together. But whenever I make a decision, it's always through a human rights, social justice lens. And so I have zero ambivalence when I'm faced with a decision. I make a lot of other people nervous with my lack of ambivalence, but healthcare as a human right is at my core. That's Virchow, and Virchow said, physicians are the natural attorneys for the poor in our profession, nursing as well, and we are because social problems to a large extent fall within our jurisdiction. Their narratives, those are the narratives that we sit up at night and thinking about, oh my gosh, what just happened in that examination? What did I just hear? What did I just see? So when it came time to do residency, we looked all across the country, said, where could we go that was at the crossroads of medicine and society? And so we picked, like Toby did, we picked a public hospital, Cook County Hospital in Chicago. Just to put this in perspective, what that was like, 3 years before it had been disaccredited, all our professors said it was career suicide to go there. Public hospitals were at one time the pinnacle of academic medicine in the United States. But by the 70s, largely because the populations they served changed and the rise of academic medicine, they became very degraded. Many were closing around the country. Cook County Hospital was threatened with closure. Here was what interview day was like. This group of people you saw, we all hopped in a car, drove 750 miles to Chicago to meet the chair of medicine, Quentin Young. We go to his office and say, we're here to be interviewed by Dr. Young. They said, he's out of town. And I said, oh my God. Next thing, some people we knew whisked us to a room. It was like this size, filled with people. We were sat in the back. Someone put a leaflet in our hands that said, Cook County Hospital closed. And people were up front exhorting the crowd about saying, you know, if we don't do this, county hospital's going to close. And some guy who was a family medicine resident, he's now a chair of family medicine in Kansas, he reached over and said, what are you here for? I said, we're here to interview in internal medicine. And he said, oh, you gotta come here, it's great. And somehow, you know, we made it through the day. The next day, Quentin Young showed up. We all did a group interview with him. And when it came time to match, we only matched one place on our match list, Cook County Hospital. And so there was, on match day, we had no ambivalence where we knew exactly where we were going, because if you're an American grad and you put Cook County Hospital down, God bless you, you're going there. Yeah, so this is where I've learned everything that I'm going to talk about today. 2 years before we went there, the doctors, the house staff went out on strike, and this is them marching downtown Chicago to protest outside of the courthouse where they had been given a back-to-work order. And so defying the back-to-work order, they marched downtown. This is still is the longest doctor strike in United States history. And they went out on strike for patient care conditions: soap, water, Spanish interpreters, EKG machines. And largely because this hospital served poor people, all poor people, and black and brown people, the conditions in there were nothing short of decrepit and disastrous. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what that was like, but this was to us, say, okay, there's a group of doctors who'll fight for patients. We're going to go there. I want to tell you a little bit about this guy, Jack Reba here. So Jack was 26, a former seminarian, graduate of Northwestern Medical School, president of the House Staff Association as an intern. And they won the strike, but the 4 strike leaders, including Jack, was thrown into Cook County Jail for defying the back to work order. So 10 days in Cook County Jail. It's Thanksgiving, and the doctor doesn't show up at the jail hospital. So they go to Jack's cell and ask him if he would mind coming out and seeing patients, which he does. He sees the patients, the jail patients, and by mistake at the end, he walks out of Cook County Jail. He's on the corner, he's on California Street in Chicago, and realizes he could hitchhike home, have Thanksgiving dinner, hitchhike back and go back to jail, until he realized that that would be a felony, and he was in for a misdemeanor, and so he knocked on the door of the cell and went back in. Actually, the serious part of the story is, this is a story about learning how to speak and speaking up. And as a young doctor, how these young doctors learn to speak up, and how Jack learned to speak up. The clock moves ahead many years. I'm a house staff at Cook County Hospital. We're working at the county jail. It's a terrible training situation for residents, so we do a work action. We said we're not going to go in there anymore. They do a search for a medical director, and sure enough, who gets to be medical director? Jack Reba. Like I said about Jack, he knew the place inside and out. But even more importantly in this story was, many years later, one of his doctors contacted him and said, I'm seeing someone who's been brought in by the police, and he looks to be tortured. He has burn marks on him. He has electrical shock marks on him. Jack went down to the jail and saw this prisoner, and sure enough, he had been tortured. And he sent a letter to the police chief in Chicago, and as a result of that letter, of Jack speaking up, there was a commander of police on the south side of Chicago who, with his henchmen, had been torturing black men into giving confessions, and many of them ended up on death row by our former mayor, who was the prosecutor, the state's attorney, Mayor Daley, putting him on death row. And because Jack was willing to speak up, this was not the first tortured person in Chicago. It had been going on for many years. It was the first time. It was a doctor speaking up, and $700 million in settlements against the city of Chicago later, the end of the death penalty in Illinois as a result of people being put on death row for being tortured. Jack's letter is on the wall of the law office that defended these death row prisoners. And the point of this talk is, we as healthcare professionals, as doctors, have a voice. We have a unique place to speak up. And Jack's very mild-mannered and not a loudmouth like me, but his speaking really made a difference in the lives of people in Chicago. When I was an intern, my parents are immigrants to this country. They came from England. My mother's family was wiped out in the Holocaust. So all my relatives were in England, and a BBC came to the United States to do a documentary on healthcare in the United States to show the Brits the comparison, and they came to Cook County Hospital. The documentary, which is on YouTube if you ever want to watch it, is I Call It Murder, because they asked a young doctor was talking about patients being transferred to Cook County simply because they lacked insurance. And many of them in very, very terrible condition, some of them dying as a result or deteriorating, unstable. And they asked this young doctor, who was a year ahead of me in residency, say, how do you describe to the British people, what's going on here? And she said, I call it murder. And that became the name of the BBC documentary. And having never seen it till I wrote my book, County, I was wondering, why did my relatives start calling my mother to ask me if I was okay? Because the documentary pretty honestly depicts what Cook County Hospital was like, healthcare for the poor. So I told you I not only learned to be a doctor at Cook County Hospital, and we learned social medicine. Because we were, I call us doctors within borders, because we would see our patients and round, and then we would go downtown to fight for the hospital to stay open. One day there was a payless payday, they ran out of money. There was a rally and said, what are we going to do with the patients? And someone said, well, if we have no money, let's take them over to Rush, because we knew that the private hospitals wouldn't take them. And so this is from the Chicago Tribune, the residents pushing patients from the emergency room next door to my hospital that I'm at now, Rush, and it's not the right thing to do that to patients, but in youthful exuberance, that's exactly what we did. It turns out that my CEO was chief resident at Rush at the time, and when my book on County came out, he said, we were furious at you. What kind of crazy people were you that you'd push these patients over there? And I said, but Larry, you have to understand, how we felt, and our backs were against the wall. And so this idea of one street, two worlds of experience in healthcare drove us. But we did learn that one could be effective at getting change by being active. It wasn't enough just to be good doctors, but that wasn't enough either. You know, just getting up and telling stories of bad things happening is not enough. So this is a formula that I'm going to come back to, that narrative plus data plus action equals change. And I think this is, in the world of fake news, we have to come back to facts and data. Narrative is not enough, because everyone has a narrative, but narrative plus data plus action equals change. So this is how I got into academic medicine. This was probably the turning point for me. So when you walk in a place like Cook County Hospital, I think one of three things happen to you. You are overwhelmed by the distress you see, overwhelmed by the suffering, and you yourself suffer, and you have to leave, not because you're a bad person, because it's really hard to experience the suffering of poor people over and over again without relief if there's not a way for you to protect yourself against. That's one thing. Another group of people just get hardened and cynical, and they put a wall between themselves and this, and they get more blame the patients for their conditions. They get through it by becoming somewhat, I call them bureaucratic doctors. They're not really, they've lost their sense of caring. And then there are people like me who said, okay, I'm here. I don't want to just become part of this. How do we begin to think about changing it? So this is how I got into academic medicine. It was the 1980s, the rise of the uninsured in the United States. We were at a place now where factories were leaving neighborhoods. So what happened in some of the neighborhoods, you had white flight in urban neighborhoods, then the factories left, first for the suburbs, then to the south and the west, and now overseas. And when the jobs left, people became uninsured. And when you had hospitals in those neighborhoods facing the uninsured, they did the only thing that they knew to do, which was put someone in an ambulance and transfer them to Cook County Hospital, or wherever there were public hospitals, and probably happened here at the University Hospital as well, that people transferred the patients. And this has been the practice from time immemorial, that patients who were uninsured got transferred to public institutions. What happened in this period of time, number of phone calls that occurred went from 100 a month to about 300 a month. And so big increase in the number of calls. And this is what it was like. You'd be a resident in the emergency room. There was no attendings in those days. You'd be standing there, the phone would ring. You'd look at it, you'd go pick it up and say, this is University of Chicago Hospital. We want to transfer your patient. Okay. There was a clipboard next to the phone. It was chained down, had paper on it. You'd fill out the paper, name of the patient, date of birth, condition, and then a checkbox, the reason for transfer. And what do you think the reason for transfer was almost 100% of the time? No insurance. And so we decided, this is my foray into academic medicine, that no one was going to listen to a group of county doctors to protest about patients being transferred because they were uninsured to a county hospital that's supposed to take care of the uninsured. But we thought it was a phenomenon that needed to be documented. So this is how we said, let's do a study. And we said, let's track 500 patients. So it took literally a couple of weeks to get 500 patients. We tracked every single patient who was transferred to Cook County Hospital. We went to the ER, we got that little sheet. We went to the bedside to talk to them. We did chart reviews on what happened to them. And what we found was that about 20+% of the patients ended up in an ICU. About the same percentage, 25% or so, were unstable at the time of transfer. And that if you're a medicine patient being transferred, and you had a higher mortality rate. I want to describe to you some of the patients. And then I've thought about some of the people on the other side of the phone who were transferring the patients, and this whole idea of speaking up. So we went to talk to the patients, and the patients had a very different story than this check the box that was on insurance. What do you think the patients told us? The reason they were told they were transferred? Better care, no beds. And I wondered, why would people say that to them? And then I realized the person on the end of the phone was someone like you and me, who was told by the hospital administrator what they could do and couldn't do. So they told a little white lie. And I will tell you, 99% of the people in this room and in the world will tell that white lie if an administrator tells you what you can do and what you can't do about taking care of patients. We will violate our Hippocratic oath if someone tells us we must do it. It's just the human condition that will follow the rules. And though that's why they told them they weren't bad people, they were just in a bad situation and didn't have the bravery to speak up. We decided we would have to write a paper on this, and we did. And we decided that besides the data, we would describe some of the patient. I'm going to describe 2 patients for you. One of them is in the table in the paper. Gunshot to the head, on a ventilator, transferred to Cook County, no insurance. Or here's one. Woman in the terminal phases of labor, 10 centimeters dilated. This one's for you. Breech delivery, foot in the vagina, transfer to Cook County, no insurance. Now imagine being the resident in that emergency room. You went to church every Sunday, you got into the best medical school, and you were told by your administrator if they had no insurance, you have to transfer them to Cook County Hospital. And when we finally, this work got out, our OBs thanked us because they had seen so many women die in our emergency room over the years because of this public policy, this policy. Oh, by the way, most of the patients were all uninsured, and they were about 90% black and brown patients. So these are just the facts. So people at Cook County were angry with us for doing this study. I was so shocked. Why would they be angry at us? Because the system works if we all catch ball with each other. So that's what county hospital was here for. We're supposed to take care of the uninsured. They're not. And if we don't take care of the uninsured, then why are we here? So people were angry with us. In fact, when the day before the paper was going to be released, we went to our public relations folks and, will you do a press conference for us? And they said, no, you have to do it yourself. And so we stood there. I was just a young attending. We stood there and we read from our own self-prepared public relations thing, shaking. And in the room next door to us, they had a counter press conference. So the hospital administration had a press conference denouncing our paper in the next room. So I'm saying the price of speaking up is to be able to resist all of the things that will come. So we didn't know where to send the paper. We sent it to the only journal we knew. It got published. It was on the front page of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Tribune. I went and testified before Congress, and the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act was passed, which is the only form of universal health care we have in the United States, was the right to emergency care, as a result of doing the study. And then I say, oh, I get it. You know, we show data, we can change the world. We can really fix this stuff. So that's how I got into academic medicine. So now I'm on part 2. Social determinants of health and inequity. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. You've probably all seen this. There's social determinants of health. Medicine focuses very much on the biological determinants of health, and we tend to be ahistorical. The major criticism I have of the way that we teach and practice medicine is the focus, relentless focus on the individual, and there's been a lot of benefit from doing this, don't get me wrong, because disease resides in individuals, and if we're going to cure an individual, it has to be a treatment aimed at the individuals. But if we're going to deal with the prevalence of disease or the burden of disease, we can't treat the individuals. We got to think about these other determinants of health. And this is the standard thing you see. And social determinants are the conditions in which people are born, grow, work, and live. And it's the environment, it's your clinical care and your behaviors, and then socioeconomic factors. But I'm going to now ask the question, yeah, but what determines them? What are the determinants of the social determinants? And that's where I want to get into this idea of equality versus equity. Has anyone seen this before? Okay, so someone tell me the difference between equality and equity. What's equality? Everyone gets the same thing. Or there's an expression that people use, a rising tide raises all boats. You know, if the tide rises, we're all going to get better. But actually, that's only true if you're in a boat, if there are not lots of other people in the boat with you to swamp that boat, if that boat doesn't have holes, and if you're in the water, a rising tide is going to drown you. So what does equity mean? It's actually those who need more should get more. Think about it. Equity means those who need more get more. Those who aren't thriving we need to pay attention to them. If you think of how we measure quality in healthcare, it's averages. You know, it's a mean. Your mean readmission rate. And if we hit a certain thing, or diabetes control rates, it's an average. But equity requires us to look at the edges of who is not thriving, and then ask the question why, and then do something about it. But equity goes again. So you think, if we think about what equity means, but what's wrong with this picture? So on the left side, you have everyone has the same box. This now they've given the short guy bigger boxes, but what's wrong with this picture? This is widely used to teach about difference between equality and equities. But what? The fence, right?
They're all still outside the park.
They're still all outside the park. What else is wrong with it? Someone's got to pay for it. Like, who gets the seats? That's a good thing. Someone's got to pay for it. And we have to decide whether equity in this country is worth paying for. You know, if grapes are better than cucumbers, and we all agree that grapes are better than cucumbers, should everyone get grapes? It's an important question. What else is wrong with this picture? They're all guys, and they're all brown people. You know, so our ideas are so embedded, you know, that we keep replicating, even in our desire to instruct. We actually, because real equity would be you'd be in the ballpark. Maybe you'd say who gets the seats behind home plate, but these guys aren't even in the ballpark. You would say, well, at least you should be able to be in the ballpark. Sometimes I've seen this with the fence down. Well, that's better than being outside the fence. but there's different ways you can do it. This is where I tend to lose some people in the audience, but if you would just bear with me, I want to talk to you about why, as a white man doctor who's been very, as a son of immigrants to this country, have been very, very successful in my own life and career, have suddenly come to talk about racism as a social determinant of inequity and why it's important to talk about it separately from poverty and other things. And so I want to try to go through this with you. So how does racism cause inequity? So in my experience as a doctor on this one street, two worlds, it's a multi-level, there are multiple insults that make racism is a cause of the accumulation of lots of social determinants of poor health in black populations. Racism is not the only thing, but I'm using this as an example of something really important for us to understand. So when you talk about social determinants of health, that seems to lump everything into one bucket. So I talk about social, structural, and economic determinants of health and political determinants of health because they're somewhat different. But racism causes health inequity because there's difference in quality of care that people get, so race, gender, even age sometimes. There's difference in access to care in this country by race, by what race or ethnicity are. We have in this country an unfortunate geographic segregation of black and brown people, poor people in particular, that doesn't exist for the white poor population, the same kind of geographic segregation. And then at the bottom of this is the opportunity for life opportunity gaps that fundamentally lead to bad health outcomes. So we know that health follows a social gradient. This is true since the beginning of time, and that the rich have better health than the poor, and the educated have better health than the poorly educated. It's true. There are countries that have very much narrowed those gaps. We have very, very large gaps in this country. But the determinants of who has the opportunity in this country is driven by racism, is one of the factors. This is where I asked the crowd, because sexism is really important as well in terms of who has opportunities and how do those opportunities get distributed. So I asked the women in the room now to raise your hand if you've never been minimized, degraded, ignored, or not, or failed to have opportunities because of your gender. And when I ask that in rooms, no women's hand ever goes up. And I'm saying, well, racism works like that too. So what racism is differential access to goods and services. It's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on how someone looks. It's bad for all of us because it saps human potential. We're leaving human potential on the table. And it's difficult for those of us who are in a position of privilege to recognize it. It's invisible to those of us in privilege because we're being actually benefited from it. I never used the word racism. I used to call it discrimination, segregation. I never used the word exploitation. I called it disinvestment. But I realized the words were important. And here's why I think it's important to name it. And I'll tell you why. In the hospital, as a former chief medical officer, when something went wrong with a patient, when a patient was harmed, it's really, we do a root cause analysis. And we do a root cause analysis that's really critical, that if you don't get the root cause of harm right, when you go to fix it, you won't fix the right thing to prevent the harm from occurring again. So that's one correlation with patient safety. The second correlation with patient safety is this idea of just culture. And just culture in the hospital, anyone know what just culture means? Just culture means if something happens and there's harm has occurred to a patient, if it's because of a malicious act, intentional malicious act, we need to address that individual's behavior who's called that malicious intentional act. But if it wasn't, we have to address the system. So when I talk about racism, I'm not talking about what happened in Charlottesville last year, though that's an important not to ignore that. It's the racism by design, by unintentional design, that actually harms people. And so if it's that system, we need to fix it. The last patient safety analogy is what we tolerate, we promote. When we tolerate, we can't do anything about historic injustices. They've happened, but what we can do is look to see how are these injustices being perpetuated today in our own institutions, and what are we doing about it? And how do we mitigate against those things? So this is why I think it's important to name it. Institute of Medicine has talked about the bias and unequal care. This is the early 2000s. What we find with any innovation in healthcare, anything, it takes about 17 years from the ideas to be generated till we begin to do something about it. And so it's about 17 years since this report came out. But for about every disease there are black-white differences, there are men-women differences in the way we actually treat people in medicine. Some of them are unconscious, sometimes they're embedded, sometimes it's mistrust on the part of the patients. So how does racism cause health inequity? Unfair concentration of black disadvantage that leaves resources in those neighborhoods different than in resources in neighborhoods where advantage is concentrated, like white neighborhoods, not all white neighborhoods, but many. Institutional racism, the way that we in healthcare or the police, incarceration practices. The embodiment of racism, people who've had historical mistrust, things that have happened. I learned today that this is the home of the founders of the Tuskegee experiment, University of VA medical college grads, but the historical mistrust, it lasts for a long time. And so maybe I don't come into care because my mother had a bad experience, my grandfather had a bad experience, but also the embodiment of privilege. The gap between our power and the power that patients have sometimes is too big to get over. And I will go into more. So I'm going to show you now how it works. This is work I've done in Chicago. So this is work, I done a lot of work in cancer disparity. I was very interested. When I finished at Cook County Hospital, I said, if I'm going to stay, I'm going to get upstream, and we're going to do prevention and early detection. So I started a breast cancer screening program, and this is how I became a professor of medicine, of writing articles on disparity while the disparity got worse. So when I finished my residency, there was no black-white gap in breast cancer mortality in Chicago. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to interpret this. But what happened in the 1990s, the white mortality rate from breast cancer dropped nicely. Now this graph is true across the whole United States. It's not just Chicago, but we use the example of Chicago to assemble the data. So the white mortality rate went down, and no one's celebrating white women's breast cancer. Still a lot of gaps, but the black rate didn't move at all. So someone explain what's going on here. Why did this happen? Got some graduating fourth-year medical students. Now's your chance to interpret data. Hypotheses.
Do white women have access to screening and prevention?
Yeah, access is one. A lot of what we heard, so, we were a little surprised by this because if you look at other disparities, like cardiovascular disparity, the curves are parallel with each other, and the white rates have gone down and the black rates have gone down, but there's still a gap. And in this one, they were equal. So how do you explain they were equal? We published this. We actually had a press conference, said we're going to create a task force. We're going to do something about it. And the blowback in the newspaper from our colleagues were, what do you think the blowback was? Explaining black mortality for breast cancer. Biology. Triple negative. So, all the oncology, oh my God. Black people have more undifferentiated breast cancers. Which we know is true. They tend to be larger at the time of diagnosis, we know is true. They're more triple negative, and it's very, very hard to treat triple negative breast cancer. But we posed the idea that it was access, and it was quality of treatment, and it was quality of access to the mammography process. We subsequently proved it was correct, but first we showed this data. So this is the map of Chicago with the high mortality areas and the hospitals that have accredited cancer programs. And you can see the cancer programs are located in low mortality white neighborhoods and not in black neighborhoods. And then we showed this graph that showed the gap between the mortality in Chicago, the US, and New York City. And we asked the question, what happens to black women's genes when you cross the Allegheny Mountains. And so New York did a lot better, and the US did a lot better in Chicago. Subsequently, we reduced this gap in Chicago by 35% by getting into the institutions and addressing what I would call inequality and quality. But this is how structural racism can work. And we got it in the newspapers, and this is not good enough about we graded hospitals on their performance, not good enough, and their performance got better over time, and the mortality got better. This is structural racism. This is a manhole cover in the middle of a mammography unit on the south side of Chicago in a safety hospital. This is how structural racism works. Who would tolerate that, right? It was tolerated year after year after year. This is Chicago's life expectancy gaps. It's 16 years. Our hospital is right here. And it's a US problem, and it's a rich-poor problem. And this rich-poor problem in life, so life expectancy gaps, there was not such a big life expectancy gap between the rich and poor in this country, and now there's a giant one. And it turns out, this is from the New York Times, and so this is about why racism matters. This is black and white boys in wealthy families, and this is what happens 30 years later. The green is white kids, and the purple is black kids, and black kids drop in income, even starting off wealthy. And when you start off poor, no one makes it up really well, but white kids make it up better than black kids. But there's a huge gradient. This is the gender gap, and you can see women fall to the bottom. So there's lots of isms we have to address. Lots of black men missing in this country. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but when you don't have black men in communities, largely because they prematurely died and because they're in prison, you have a gap between the male-female ratio in these neighborhoods. And Ferguson is the worst of all the cities in the United States. It's white women are dying and without college degrees, and white men, and it's lowered US life expectancy. Economists call these diseases of despair. These were not things we talked about when it was happening in black communities, but actually white women mortality rate without a degree has now met black women's mortality rate without a college degree. And it's a national crisis, and it's dropped US life expectancy. So it's not just a black problem. So here's how I'm going to end on this now. What's the solution? Practice medicine with your heart and feet here. So this is from the healthcare debates, probably when you guys were in college. Some of you, I like this one, no pubic option. But the whole idea is that these are issues of urgent public policy. So here's my prescription for burnout. So how can you do this? One is act personally. Speech and practice choices. You can choose to serve the poor. You can choose to speak up when an administrative policy in your institution is laid down that requires you to violate your Hippocratic Oath. Locally, make health equity a strategy within your institution. It's got to be a strategy because otherwise we're never going to close these gaps. Make it a strategy in your division first. Make it in your department. Have these conversations institutionally about why equity needs to be pulled out separate from the other things we do. Because if these things are structural, they're structural solutions. Put the equity lens in and say, how does this decision we just made perpetuate a historical injustice that has white on top and black and brown in the bottom? Whether that be about Medicaid policies, what patients get seen in what clinics, or whether it's men on top and women on the bottom, or the wealthy on top. You can look at your policies for where do Medicaid patients get into your clinics at University of Virginia. At Rush, we made access to Medicaid and access to the uninsured available to all of our academic physicians, all of our employed physicians. A Medicaid patient or a uninsured patient can see them. We made a policy, we changed policy. They're not in the resident clinics only. And then nationally, fighting for guaranteed health care for all, or the marches last weekend. So I'm just going to end on these notes. This is a young woman who died at 25 of Wilson's disease at Cook County Hospital. Our doctors wouldn't see her because she was uninsured. I was chief medical officer across the street. So goodwill alone doesn't do this if you don't change public policy. I got involved with a community group who wanted transplants for the undocumented. And after a few years, without going into the details of what we did, We pulled all the places around the table, and 86 people have gotten transplants in Chicago who are undocumented, uninsured, mostly kidney transplants. 75% have gotten organs from their family members. Where no access and injustice and inequity, I got involved with it. This guy was just in a newspaper, Miguel Perez, deported, a green card holder, two-time Afghan vet, TBI, from grenade attacks, got into trouble with drugs, was in prison, and deported. The community group asked me to be his doctor. I went into ICE and examined him and did a medical report that got to a senator to try to keep him in this country. And I just step into these things. I wait for them to come to me. Personally, we can do these kinds of things. So I'm going to end on this note. This is last week, the March Against Violence in Chicago. You see doctors demand action. We have a role to play in public policy in this country. And finally, across the street from Cook County Hospital, there's a park. It's called Pasteur Park. Louis Pasteur statue is there, and there's a sign, and this is why I became a doctor. One doesn't ask of one who suffers, what is your country, what is your religion, what is your insurance status? I made that one up there. One merely says, you suffer, this is enough for me, you belong to me, and I shall help you. And so that's why I think we all go into medicine. If we all practice our oath and live by it, the world will be a lot better place. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm gonna read briefly and discuss some remarks that I have as my response as a graduating fourth-year medical student to reading The Death Gap and having spoken with Dr. Ansell. And so a little bit about who I am. So I'm a child of two African immigrants, grew up in the suburbs of northern New Jersey, about 8 to 10 miles from in a relatively affluent community, 8 to 10 miles from the Bronx, New York, in which resides the South Bronx, which is one of the poorest congressional districts in the United States. Private school educated, Duke undergraduate, and now med student preparing for a career in medicine. And so, like a lot of my colleagues who had to leave for our other internship readiness material, this is the moment that we've been waiting for. We've thought about becoming a doctor for a large part of our lives, and now, finally, that's upon us. And so for me, I'm deciding to go to, or the match is deciding for me, to take me to Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami. And so this is a hospital, public hospital like Cook County, where Dr. Ansell has been, that takes care of a large population of undocumented immigrants from Latin America, immigrants from the Caribbean and Haiti, and makes it their mission to be able to take care of this population. They have clinics for the homeless. They have a mobile van that goes and takes care of children of undocumented immigrants, and that's kind of where I'm stepping into, and that was in a large part by design. And so I think about the day of our white coat ceremony when we were beginning medical school. Here at UVA, they asked us to write a phrase to describe what is it that you want to be true of yourself in medicine. And after reading this book and reflecting, I looked at the statement that I wrote, and I found some of it still to be true. And so one of the iterations of this statement that I wrote down read as follows: I will strive to acquire the knowledge and skill to apply compassion to those who are hurting and to those who have no voice. And in thinking about the remark that says that physicians are natural advocates for the poor, I think that reading this book, The Death Gap, reawakens that and connects me to that as I head into residency in internal medicine pediatrics in a public hospital. And so it's timely for us as medical students. This is the calm before the storm. A lot of us are doing this internship readiness where we are starting to imagine ourselves as physicians now, no longer as medical students, but now with more responsibility. We're trying to figure out where we're gonna live, how to move, but we have a small break to be able to figure out what type of physician is it that we are going to be. The MD behind our name is more than just being able to prescribe medications and sign orders. This now carries weight in the communities that we're going to be a part of. And so for me, a lot of the emotions that I had in reading this were shock, thinking about one of the things that Dr. Ansell mentions in his book is how if we were to look at the urban African American in the US as a group, they would look like a country that we are sending humanitarian aid to. And that was shocking to me. When you learn about these disparities, for me, that provoked a pretty visceral reaction and indignation. How is this happening where I live? You know, I lived in close to the South Bronx. We're here in Charlottesville. Dr. Ansell is in Chicago, where block to block, 15 years of life expectancy or more just vanish. But the thing that was great was this left me with hope that I, as an MD, am empowered to be able to demand more of the institutions that I'm in, of the people that I work with, and of myself to be this advocate for the patients who don't have a voice. And so going forward, some of the things that I think we can all aspire to is we can aspire to have solidarity with these patients. We can listen. It doesn't take a lot to do that. Just listen and try to understand where it is that our patients are coming from. Who are they? What are the barriers to health that they face? And more than that, we can actually do something. When we are in settings where we have the opportunity to say, my patient needs this because they do not have the ability to obtain this by themselves, we can be the person to speak up for these communities that end up being invisible. If we don't make them visible, often, who will? And so I just want to close with the last title of the last chapter of Dr. Ansell's book, which is Observ Judge Act. We can keep our eyes open. We no longer have an excuse for not being aware of what's going on in our communities. We can look, we can ask questions, we can demand more of the environments that we're in, and we can make small acts of solidarity that will involve personal sacrifice to try to be able to provide our patients, despite their background, with the care that they need. Thank you.
So we're gonna open the floor for some questions, and I'm gonna ask the first one. So this is for Dr. Ansell. How do you think that we, in training as medical students and residents, can prepare to be social advocates for our patients? So kind of to what extent can it be learned and infused into medical education?
Well, I think medical education has changed, so these concepts are being introduced. I could have done that myself, by the way. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I have a pretty loud voice. You know, I think across the country, medical schools are trying to figure out a way to teach these concepts, though I don't think that's broadly infused. You know, we tend to be relatively conservative people, and going into medicine. When you go into medicine, you think about what you're going to do, and when you're faced with understanding that there are these, you know, huge social conditions that seem unmanageable, most of us shy away from that. I just think, like everything else we do, it requires practice. And I will say it's not a large step to go from personal advocacy on behalf of a patient to advocacy on behalf of a community. And in my own approach to this is I stand by the Hippocratic Oath. And you think about that oath, it's quite powerful. There's only 2 times in your life you do a public oath. One is when you get married, and sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't work. And the other time is when you become a doctor. You do a public oath, and when you marry medicine, you're married for life. I know hardly anyone who gets divorced from medicine. But that oath has we have a special obligation for that. When you can translate that into work, it's much harder to go up against the will of an institution or the will of a department. But I think if you can, like everything else we do, practicing speech and practicing action, medicine demands that of us. It's just like everything else, it requires practice.
Okay, we're a little over time, but we have time for a couple of questions, and then both Dr. Ansell and Toby will be here for a few minutes more to take your questions. So other questions or comments? We'll bring you a mic.
Right in front of you, right here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right.
Oh.
Thanks so much for your remarks. And my name is Cameron Webb. I'm the Director of Health Policy and Equity here for the School of Medicine. And I got to know Quentin Young when I was living in Chicago, so I have a little sense of your background. And he told a story once of Dr. Jack Geiger, who you're also probably familiar with, who was treating some children who were malnourished and wrote prescriptions for food. And his remark was, last time I checked, the treatment for malnourishment would be food. And I'm wondering, that's a pretty disruptive thought in today's medical environment. And what are some of the most disruptive notions or practices physicians can use in trying to address some of these social issues?
Well, I was thinking food is not that disruptive. So I think we have when we think about innovation in healthcare, we think about things like precision medicine and these other notions of ways of improving health outcomes. I think what would be really disruptive is bringing public health back into medicine in a much more direct way. If you look at countries that have done better on health outcomes, even in the midst of poverty, places like Cuba, for example, they've taken a public health approach and gotten upstream. And then addressing food, not at the point of care of delivery in the clinic, but food access in the community and the schools. I actually don't think that, I don't think it's disruptive. I actually think it's disruptive if we don't do it. The other place where I think we have to advocate, I say for this, is that universal health care. How can we be the only country in the world that doesn't, developed countries, that have universal health care? In Canada, for example, you do not have these poor-rich life expectancy gaps. So health care by itself, reformed, will make a difference. I think that these are, so 2 things. We have to get involved way more directly with public health as part and parcel of our training and our practice, and we have to advocate for universal health care, in my mind, single-payer health care.
Somebody else? Well, I think we'll close this formal session, but again, they will be here to talk with you informally. Also, the Death Gap is available through UVA Bookstore outside. Again, thank you for your patronage and your participation in Medical Center Hour across this entire year. Our programs will resume on September 12th. So have a safe and wonderful summer season. Thank you again to Dr. David Ansell and soon to be Dr. Toby Ubu.